Hello, everyone. Welcome to Total Text Live, Episode 2 with Vincent Hunanyan. He has, I recently picked up the Black Book of Poems. It's a fantastic piece, available on Amazon, and you can get it, hard copy and all that. I'll be sure to include links below after we're done. But I want to get right to the discussion. The first thing I want to ask Vincent, and I picked up your book, and I was absolutely enamored of your preface, because my approach to poetry is very different, but I was absolutely amazed by the way that you explored poetry in the preface of the Black Book, where you expressed some reservation about interpreting the poems. My poems are very, very autobiographical. And so for me, I'm very excited to hear a different perspective on this. So could you give us a little bit of insight into why you took that approach?
Sure. I mean, first of all, when I wrote the preface, I thought about all the professors that I had in my past as well. And I always thought about the fact that most people, they don't really enjoy poetry, right? And I was always thinking about why is that? And the best reason, or the best, question or answer that I could come up with was that not only have they been exposed to too much bad poetry, but they're also been forced by their professors to interpret a piece in a certain way, which kind of kills your own imagination, right? So if you're sitting in a class and your professor tells you to read a piece by Frost, right? And you read the piece, and something in your subconscious or in your mind says, oh, okay, this is what it means to me. And then when it's time to speak about the poem, you raise your hand and you say, well, professor, I think this piece celebrates life. And your professor shuts you down and says, no, that's not at all what's happening in the poem, because this piece is about death, right? For example, that kind of ruins the whole, I think, purpose of the piece in itself, right? Because to be a poet, to write a poem, for example, if I would include a description of every poem that I wrote in my book, right? Exactly word for word, what I was thinking, why I was writing it, or what I was feeling at the time, then, what's the point of writing it? That's the way I see it, right? Because I think poetry should give you something very, it should be almost a metaphysical experience, right?
And it should be introspective too.
Right.
It's not just about the author, it's about the person who's experiencing it.
Of course.
I actually talk in my classes when we go over poetry and literature. I love to talk about the kind of conflict between caring and prioritizing what the writer is doing, and then giving equal time and considering the meaning of the poem as it is created through the person who is experiencing it. That both of those things have value, and oftentimes the way that students get educated, they only put attention on one of those things, and kind of like a really weird preservation of correctness.
Right.
So yeah, I really thought your preface in that point was incredibly valuable and incredibly important. This is kind of a weird, oddball question. Why the Black Book?
Good question. The thing is, I'm a big Pink Floyd fan.
Yes, awesome.
Yeah, and there's the song where he goes, "I got a little black book with my poems in it."
Huh.
And I don't know. I was thinking about this song when I was thinking of a title. I almost didn't think of it at all. It kind of popped up in my mind because the cover I already had in my head. I thought it was going to be a black cover, and I want to keep it as minimalistic as possible. I didn't want any drawings or pictures, and I wanted to be kind of very in your face kind of. And so I thought about it, and I thought about the subject matters of the poems in general are pretty dark. There's some positivity in it, I guess, and some love. But all in all, I'd say it is a pretty dark book. So having all those ideas in my mind, I said, well, that's a perfect title. Plus, it was an alliteration, which I love. Black Book, right? So it's good.
We talked about alliteration before we went live, and I was so happy to hear you talk about that, because in my classes when I teach poetry, I often paint English as an ugly language, right?
Really?
I actually do. And I talk about its Germanic roots.
Right,
And
right.
I talk about the speed and the consonants. And so for me personally, alliteration is something that works much better in English. Alliteration and repetition. And I often subject rhyme to de-emphasis. And I'm like, not the biggest fan of rhyme. You pull it off extremely well.
Thank
But
you.
with the alliteration in the title, this also kind of leads me to another interesting question. Your writing style is incredibly accessible, as opposed to some of the other poems that I've seen from people who are doing really pretentious kind of high wall stuff, you know, really, really deep, complicated references. But for all of yours, there is accessibility. And I've often kind of been in a conflict of that. Were you conscious of, you know, trying to keep your poems on a, you know, even keel for people to have more accessibility? Was that something you were thinking about?
Actually, no. The way I write poetry, it's always in two ways. First, it can start off as something as I'll go like rambling in my mind, and so I'll start writing things down, or I'll be at the gym, and then, you know, a line pops in my head, and I go, okay, this could be a good line to, you know, could be a good beginning to a poem. But as far as the rhyming, I never try to force something in it, right? If I write a poem and it sounds much better without the rhyming, even though I don't do a lot of free verse, but if it sounds better without and it's impactful, I'll leave it like it. But for me, to get the rhyme in the poem is the challenge, right?
Yeah.
Personally, and to make it sound effortless, and to make it, as you said, you know, well, to sound as unpretentious as possible, right? So
Yeah.
I think that's the biggest challenge of writing a good poem. And yeah, I feel like a lot of people who try to rhyme these days, they make it too hard on themselves, right? They have too many notions in their mind that they feel like they have to transfer to the paper, and so what happens is you kind of start overthinking it, if you will, right?
Yeah.
And so I'm not saying that, you know, I'm not Eminem, right? I can't go like line for line, like out of my, like in 2 seconds, and, you know, it all rhymes. I wish, right? But a lot of times, and the more you write too, the more you'll start kind of seeing what goes with what as well. So
yeah,
if that answers the question, yeah.
Your rhyming was incredibly natural, and I actually talk about that a lot. Again, I'm in a very teacher mindset right now, so I think a lot about, you know, using stuff for instructional material. And I tell students that when it comes to poetry, you don't want to sacrifice meaning for rhyme. And as I'm reading your poems, I never had that feeling. It felt almost lyrical, you know, almost kind of like and one of them actually says it was written for guitar.
Right.
And it has that songwriting kind of mentality to it. I love that you brought up Eminem. There's only one Eminem, you know, we all agree.
And it's funny, we brought up, you know, lyrics and Eminem, because the whole thing started with me in my teens. I think I was like 12, 13, 14. And I was, and, you know, that was a time when 8 Mile had come out, and, you know, Eminem was really, you know, he was the name at that point. And me and a friend, we started writing rap songs. And he had a little recording studio in his room, a little mic. So we did a lot of, you know, amateur stuff. But all those times that I was writing, it was always with a beat in mind, or I would listen to music or to a beat, and I would write and write and write. And so I guess that was the foundation of what led to me later in my life, that when I kept doing it, because essentially what's a song? I mean, what's a lyric? It's a poem written for music, right?
Yeah.
And so in my mind, most of my poems that I write, I kind of want them to sound, I kind of want them to flow, right? To make them sound almost as they are lyrics. And a lot of them are. Yeah. So
And again, I love the differences between us, because for me, I like to make ugly, nasty, just like poetry. And I think that's part of the reason why when I was reading your work, it was very refreshing. I was like, oh my gosh, it can be pleasant. All right, it doesn't always have to be aggressive and like almost weird death metal.
Right, right, right.
On that note, also another question I wanted to ask, and this was something we talked about before. As I was reading the reviews of your book, somebody made a comment about about the Black Book being a great way to introduce poetry to people who are not acclimated to it. I've made some comments in the past that we kind of stoop our students in the classics. We talk about the classics a great deal. And that's something that always bothered me, because I was like, if you want to get somebody interested in poetry, you don't really want to do it with Shakespeare. You work your way up to Shakespeare.
Right.
And as I was reading this review, I was like, this is an excellent way to introduce people to poetry. Again, and I guess I might be leading this question a little too much, but was that anything that you intended, or how do you feel about that idea?
Well, no, it was nothing. It wasn't intentional. I do take it as a big compliment that someone would think of my book as a good intro to poetry. And I do agree with you that if you want to introduce someone to poetry, you don't necessarily have them read Pope or Shakespeare or again. And actually, I don't enjoy Pope. I remember having him in school, and for me, when you have a poem that goes on for 20 plus pages, for me it's kind of by the time you reach the end, you don't remember what the poem was about. You know what I mean? So for me, I think for me personally, the challenge lies in to make it as impactful in as few lines as possible. And I think that's the challenge with poetry in general, right? Because the difference between, for example, and because I write short stories as well. And so the difference between a good poem and a short story, I think a good poem is much, much harder to write, because, in a novel or a short story, you have space, you have time, right? You have the beginning, you have the middle, you have the end, and then everything in between. You can think about it, you can drag it out a little bit. But if you can write a poem in, 10, 12 lines, and the reader, after reading it, just takes a break and thinks, wow, okay, like that, right? Something like almost this metaphysical sense. I think that's the challenge. But to answer the question, as far as being a good intro to poetry, again, I'm flattered someone would think that, and the way I see it today, a lot of people my age or younger even, I think their first exposure to poetry is a lot of bad poetry, and I don't want to mention any names, but there's a lot of, I think a lot of people, they'll read a lot of Tumblr poetry, if you will, 2 lines written out with no real depth to them, if you will. And that's fine, like, whatever you like. Or I don't think those people who are writing that stuff, I don't think they intentionally think, okay, I'm going to write something superficial, because to them, obviously it's not, right? But what I'm saying is, if that's your first introduction with poetry, then yeah, Shakespeare would seem like a different planet, right? So I think you should start reading as much as you can, as much different poetry as you can, so that after a while, when you have read both Shakespeare and the so-called Tumblr poetry, then you can say, okay, maybe I'm not a Shakespeare fan, maybe I'm not a fan of this, but maybe something in the middle. Then it'll be easier. So but yeah, I think definitely that more people should acquaint themselves with the classics as well. So not only whatever's being sold today. I don't think that's a good way of acquainting yourself with poetry. I think you should vary. I mean, just like anything else, right? You don't know if you can, if your first car is Mercedes, you've had Mercedes for 30 years. You can't just say Mercedes is the best car because you've never really had any other car, right? I mean, it's easy to say the Mercedes is the best car because you've only had it. But if you had, all the other brands, or even if you, test driven them, then you know what you prefer. So.
I'm really digging the Tumblr shade. Like, that's like the chances of this video going viral are like, ooh. Right? That's awesome though.
Well,
Uh, the direction I wanted to go into next was there's a couple of poems with a unified theme of like bad or commentary on parenting and poverty. And I've always, again, you'll notice that there's a lot of conflict from me in these instances because, like, for me, I'm in kind of like a weird in-between position right now as far as like, what is the poet's role in social commentary? Is it our job to call attention to things? And is it our job to, start that kind of conversation? Before I, completely finish this though, when you were talking about that feeling of, that heaviness when you've read a good poem and you just kind of sit back and take a breath and think about it. It's like savoring a really good piece of cheesecake.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah. Or wine. Yeah.
Of it. Yeah. So do you think that that's a role that like we as poets should play as far as like, almost kind of like being like a prophet in some ways?
Well, honestly, I don't like when artists get too political. Like these days, every other actor or singer, they'll have their, opinion, and I think it ruins a lot. For example, if you had a childhood actor that you've loved your whole life, and that guy goes up and starts saying a lot of political things, and you think, my image of you as this great actor just kind of ruined. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
but at the same time, I mean, I write whatever's on my mind, whatever I think about, right? I don't. When I, for example, when I wrote the book, I wasn't thinking, okay, I got to make this as political as possible so people will start talking about it, or people start, go on debates talking about parenting and stuff like that. No, that wasn't my intention at all, and I think it shouldn't be anyone's intention. I don't think whether you're a singer, you're in a band, you're a poet or a writer. I don't think you should go consciously in the process of saying that, okay, I'm going to write a piece demonstrating the war because I want people to start demonstrating in the streets or whatever. I think all that should be subtle and it should come natural.
I love that idea.
Right. So it's the same idea of, if you don't force it, it will come out anyway, right?
Yeah.
Most of my poetry comes from my subconscious. That's a fact, right? I don't, I'll start writing something and it will almost write itself a lot of times. And that's always the best kind of poetry, is when you start writing something and then it just comes out and comes out and comes out. And maybe initially, and the funny thing is, you can write a poem that you can read through and you're like, even I don't get it. And I just wrote it, right? But it's something that comes from your own subconscious that after a while you'll start making sense of it. And then you start putting the pieces together. And I think it's the same. And I know I'm kind of deviating from the question a little bit, but
you're fine. Great.
For me, a perfect poem will have the same effect as a good song. For example, have you had that feeling when you're overwhelmed with work or homework or papers, whatever, and you're so busy in the process, and you have the radio on, or you have some playlist you haven't listened to, whatever. There's music coming, but you're not really paying attention to the music because you're so taken by your work, right? You're so absorbed by it. But as you go through your work, anxious and overwhelmed, there's a song that's being played that you kind of, even though you're doing what you're doing, you kind of stop and you're like, whoa, but you've already listened to like 2 hours of music, but somehow, somewhere, this song is being played, and all of a sudden you think, okay, well, what's that, right?
Yeah.
So that's the feeling that I kind of talk about in the preface as well, right? This kind of, if a poem makes you feel something, right? As far as you can read it 10 times, and maybe on the 15th time, you'll stand back, right? I think for me personally, my favorite poems that I still recite till this day, that I've read maybe 3-4 years ago. I can be in the shower thinking about some line from that poem, that piece, and it will hit me 3 years after I've read the poem. I'm not joking, and I will think, oh shit, that's maybe what it meant.
Yeah.
Right. And so And so to tie it back to your question, no, I don't think that artists should be consciously political about something and going into the work, because then I don't think it will be. I think it would be forcing it too much. Now you can be a really good artist and you can be really good at what you do. For example, if you're a good singer, you're a good songwriter, you can still write a good song with an agenda, right? Because we all have an agenda, right? Consciously or subconsciously. But if you force it, no, I think readers are too intelligent. Well, most of them anyway. They're too intelligent to kind of sense that, right?
Yeah, one of the things that I'm kind of taking from this conversation so far that I think is really interesting is a lot of the stuff that I've noticed and a lot of things that I've kind of really selected as really valuable about your work and about your viewpoint have been things that were unintentional. And I'm like, that's kind of the essence of being a true creative, right? Is the thing that resonates, is the thing that just kind of like pop appeared out of the eye.
Right.
And knowing that what you've written has a diversity of reactions to it, that, you know, there's a lot of different ways of approaching the thing. It's actually really, really cool. I think that that's about all the time and all the questions that I have for today. Would you, and you know, we could always kind of come back and do a poem reading later if you want.
Of course.
Okay, so I think I'm going to have to just sort of wrap it up there. But listen, I can't thank you enough for being on the show.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me. Really.
Like I actually think that some of the poems and some of the writing that I've been doing, I'm going to go back and reapproach now, right? Because like I have a new kind of renewed zeal for it and a new viewpoint. And
that's the beauty of good conversation, right? You get different ideas. Yeah.
Yeah, this is fantastic. So I'd love to have you on again someday. I really enjoyed the book, and I will link it below this video. And thank you so much, man. I appreciate it.
And I'll tell you what, David, actually, we can do it this way as well. If you can link people to my Instagram and have them write to me and say, hey, I watched the show, I will actually send out 50 books myself that I'll autograph to those people, the first 50 people.
Fantastic.
Okay.
That is great. Awesome.
So we can do that to you know, bring some more value to the audience.
That I can't thank you enough, man. This has been great. And
my pleasure, really.
All right. You keep being awesome.
Thank you.
All right.